Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you, the audience, for giving up your Sunday afternoon to listen to us talk about knowledge networks. So thank you for being here. We've brought together 5 scholars who work on networks and knowledge circulation. The original title of this was Ancient Knowledge, so we're quite happy it's been changed to medieval, because there are 3 ancient people who are sitting on this side, and then 3 contemporary, so we'll be in conversation with each other. And this panel, it really emerged out of a series of conversations we were having about how networks function, how they functioned in the past, how they function now, how the JLF, in fact, functions as a network. And we're asking sort of the question of why is scholarship these days obsessed with networks in the past? And we're asking questions about sort of pre-textual knowledge, post-textual knowledge, embodied knowledge, how these circulated as well. Because when you think of a literature festival, you would think, of course, of texts, but we're going to try to move beyond that, to talk about oral traditions, religious traditions, skills, how these circulated as well in the past. And most importantly, one question we'd really like to talk about is that most of the people on this panel will have spent much of their lives and will continue to spend much of their lives researching quite obscure questions, reading texts and archives and manuscripts that really only a tiny number of people will read. In fact, I know in my case, in my PhD, I was probably the only person to have read those documents in 500 years. And when you open it, they ask you to use a mask because there are still plague bacteria sometimes in the manuscript. So the question is, why do we do that? What drives us as people to make such life choices? How do these choices create meaning for us and hopefully for other people? And so these are the sorts of questions we'll talk about. I will let each presenter introduce themselves and talk a bit about how their work touches on the question of knowledge networks and circulation. Shall we move from let's travel back in time. Let's start with the contemporary and move to the ancient. So Leili, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Laili Ad-Din. I'm a historian of East Bengal and Assam. I look at the making and unmaking of nation states. In particular, I look at the sort of charismatic leadership of a figure called Maulana Bashani, who is in some ways quite unknown to the audience and to today. And largely because, and also, I mean, I guess the area of the space of East Bengal is something that isn't really understood properly today. And that's largely because the colonial imagination of what East Bengal was, or what these peripheral spaces were, has extended to this day today. So the work that I do is really a sort of empathy for those who are slighted, who are hard done by history, who are seen to produce no knowledge, or their knowledge is of no significance. So I look at the political mobilization of peasants and workers and their figures and what sort of knowledge they produce. I look at this guy called Maulana Bashani, who's otherwise known as the Red Maulana, and look at how he explains and sort of understands Islamic socialism in the form of festivals, in the form of boat tours, in the form of religious oaths in East Bengal and Assam, and in the sort of formation of mobilization of anti-colonial networks.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Yes. So, and it addresses quite nicely this idea of non-textual knowledge and how it circulates, and forms of knowledge that aren't necessarily viewed even as knowledge at the time, but they will have a significance certainly to you, and that is what we will ask you later on. And we'll let Paniz introduce herself.
Wonderful. First, mashallah, this sounds amazing. So yeah, I'm a PhD student at SOAS, at the Center for Gender Studies. In the writing up time now, where you realize that you actually don't know nothing and ask yourself a lot what you're actually doing. I'm looking in my research at the political conditions under which Afghan artists and art students today, or since the US invasion in 2001, are producing visual arts. And I understand visual arts as a form of visual knowledge that we need to, however, look at in its particular time and geography being produced. So I began looking at contemporary Kabuli woman artists when I started in 2013, realizing that my access to very limited knowledge, which is basically on Afghan arts just online, reproduces kind of the hegemony of Anglophone, English-speaking knowledges about the ongoings in Kabul. And going to Afghanistan over the past 2 years helped me to actually create a more, I hope, critical picture about the coexistence of different discourses and gender relations within the context of Kabul, where not just contemporary art is being studied, but legacies from the Soviet Union to the Islamic Republic of Iran, to Pakistan, to India, all shape kind of the very fractured visual art scene that also represents the fractured nature of the geopolitical landscape of Afghanistan and Afghans who work and produce and lived in Afghanistan, in Iran and Pakistan. So I'm kind of looking at the geopolitics and the local politics of visual knowledge production and the potential of these visual knowledges to produce a knowledge which is which can tell us something about embodied experiences. And embodied experiences basically beyond the reproduction of Afghan women in Western media and pop culture that we're so used to. So when I say Afghan woman, first thing you think of maybe is the woman in the blue burqa. So trying to take off the burqa and see what's actually below that. Although I don't like this image neither. I mean, I like it a lot, but I mean, okay, yeah. Thank you for the invitation also.
This is the revolutionary side of the panel, if you hadn't guessed, actually. So James, please.
Hi, I'm James Karen, and I'm a lecturer in Islamicate South Asia at SOAS. So I work on Afghan poetry, basically, in the Pashto language, which is not a sort of hegemonic language in any of the countries that it's spoken in. I mean, readership of literary networks in Afghanistan is typically in Persian, in Pakistan is typically in Urdu, or some other language. So I started looking at Pashto literature as a way to figure out what I could tell about societies with an archive which by definition is not a sort of dominant one, which sort of compiles perspectives over time of people who are perhaps themselves integrated into authority, but speaking at that time in a sphere that's not. So, I mean, people can move between the different spheres of their lives. You could be a sort of a general or a mansabdar, like somebody who's running a regional court. When you speak in Persian, then it's a different thing from when you speak in Pashto. So I wanted to see what this knowledge network does on its own. As I'm doing that, I realized that actually, I mean, the very earliest text we've got comes from, we've got two manuscripts. One comes, I believe, from Bukhara, the other in Uzbekistan, the other comes from Hyderabad in South India. So in other words, these are enormously huge networks spatially. Not only that, and they always have been since the dawn of Pashto literacy. Not only that, a lot of the knowledge forms that I was finding remain remarkably stable. Empires who sort of rule these, like create territories and these things, come and go. Knowledge forms produced in the sort of sub-elite or non-elite spheres are actually a bit more durable. And so I wanted to know both spatially and temporally what consequences this had. So in other words, to make a long story short, I realized that I couldn't restrict it spatially or temporally. So now the project is basically interregional literary networks on a sub-elite level everywhere from Uzbekistan to South India, and every place since the rise of since the rise of the Mughal Empire until the mother of all bombs, like last month. So what does Afghan poetry tell us about power, violence, domination that not only implicates sort of early modern political formations, but the very same political formations now that we pay our taxes to and are ourselves implicated in?
So everywhere and everything. Yes.
Yeah.
It's not an ambitious project at all.
No.
So shall we have, so that continues the radical strand of the panel. I think we're more the reactionary strand, I would say. I don't think we venture further than the 18th century, perhaps, the three of us, and interacting mainly with the dead, trying to speak to them, commune with them through archives. Essentially, we're basically mediums on this half of the panel. So, Gagan, tell us a bit about what you do, how it relates to networks. Your whole research is networks, basically, but quite different from...
Thank you, Nora. Reactionary or atavistic, I'm not quite sure. It's a delight. It's wonderful to be in the presence of such esteemed colleagues and in your presence this afternoon. I'm a faculty member at the London School of Economics just down the road, where I teach history, the history of the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire in particular. And the research that keeps me off the streets and occupied is about trying to recover, recapture, reconstruct the regional dimensions of everyday life that spanned the Middle East and South Asia, from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Syria in the west to Bengal in the east. And as part of that, trying to figure out the relationships between state and society, particularly, a bit like James, from the society side of things, where you had lots of individuals, sub-elites, ordinary folk, doing very significant things. And yet we don't know very much about them. And yet they were important, if nothing else, for the polities in Iran, in India, in Syria, in Egypt, to persist in the manner to which they'd become accustomed. These brokers, these traders, these diplomats, these pilgrims, traveling back and forth, engaged in information and idea exchange, and they've been lost and forgotten. And so me and all of us, I think, in some fashion, are trying to recover them and thus revise our understandings of these histories that resonate, continue to resonate with our here and now.
Brilliant. It's less reactionary than I had anticipated. Arthur, would you like to talk a bit about your work and how it relates to the theme of knowledge networks and circulation?
Yeah, hello. I'm Arthur Dudley. I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Cambridge. And my work looks at something that we can call the Persian cosmopolis, this huge swath of Asia from Anatolia, which is to say modern-day Turkey, to Western China, throughout the Indian subcontinent, all the way really to the southern tip, where Persian was a language of administration and a language of high culture. And it was, in some ways, very much the way that in the Renaissance, Latin was the language that had currency from one end of Europe to the other. And what I'm questioning are present-day nation-state-based ways of looking at language and the ideology of language. So people typically think of Persian as the national language of Iran and of Tajikistan, and a kind of with a sort of odd status in Afghanistan, but those are the languages that truly own Persian, and therefore anything that happened in the Indian subcontinent in Persian was somehow fake, derivative, the product of people without a true native understanding of the language. But if you think about Latin and Europe, then this is sort of nonsensical. Indians had as much right to use Persian and as much affection for it as people who were what we would call native speakers of the language. And so I'm writing a long history of Persian literary culture that looks at the way in which in which texts and people moved across that huge territory that I described. And in particular, what I'm interested in is education. How did people in India actually learn Persian? It turns out we don't really know. And yet, we know that by the 18th century, there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands of village schools that were teaching Persian. So trying to work out that linguistic, cultural system and its implications for present-day India, present-day South Asia, really, and the connection with the other remnants of this Persian cosmopolis. So that's what I do.
Brilliant. So there's definitely a theme emerging about recovering histories that have been neglected in between the fault lines of nation states and nationhood, and certainly a theme of attempting to commune with the dead. So that leads me to my first question for Lely. about Maulana Bashani. We'll return to the contemporary, having traveled to the past. So my question is for Leili, and then we'll open up. We'll ask a few questions. James has a few questions. I have a few questions for our panelists, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience, should you have any questions for us. So Leili, you work on Maulana Bashani, this figure who he's a political figure. He's a figure of historical study and analysis, but he's also an individual of great spiritual significance as well, and of great personal importance, from what I've understood of your work, to a large number of followers today. You've been telling me about how people dream about him, how he still guides people.
Yes.
So the question for you is, as a researcher, what is your relationship to Maulana Bashani? Is he a spiritual guide? Is he a political leader? How do you relate to this individual who was once living and breathing, who was once a human being? How do you relate to him?
In some ways, it's a very personal relationship. As someone who comes from a sort of working class background, we're often told that we don't produce politics, we produce emotions, we don't produce ideas, we don't produce knowledge. We are often led rather than leading. Our ideas are not as creative. So when I see someone like Maulana Bashani, who is at the forefront, I mean, this is a guy who's, if you go to the National Archives, if you try to recover him, he's derided as a figure of, he's seen as a figure of rusticity, of illiteracy, of ignorance. And whereas this is a person who's talking through or about Islamic socialism through religious oaths, who's coming through sort of dreams, and who's leading, and who's going around to China, who's going around to Cuba, and and he's leading one of the most formative sort of left coalitions in Pakistan. If there was any sort of all-Pakistan figure after Jinnah, it is Bashani. I mean, it's a very personal relationship to Bashani, because I think it's a way of accessing worlds like mine, of accessing our ideas, our emotions, our experiences. And Bashani, in some ways, is a text for subaltern politics. It's in a way, it's a way of accessing sort of the communities that don't produce text itself. I think about, what are the intellectual lives of the working class? What do they produce? So dreams is something that isn't spoken,
when you and I talk a lot about. We're both curators here at the library, and dream interpretation is something that is a daily topic.
So one of the most fascinating conversations that I had in my fieldwork, which was really just a way going around and speaking to Marids, but also going through intelligence archives and special branches and police, and because that's where the politics of peasants and workers reside. So one of the conversations I had was with an 83-year-old devotee of Maulana Bashani, and I spoke to him. So I was speaking to him, and in conversation I asked him, so when did you see your murshid, your peer, last? And he said, well, he came to me about a month or 2 years ago. This guy Bashani has been dead, he died in 76. But he appears in a dream in sort of 2014 or 2013. And so I'm like, so what were you doing? I was reading a newspaper, and this is a guy who read up to class 5, and I was reading a newspaper, so I shooed him away, and I said, not now. Come back later.
I'm focusing on reading.
Yeah, I'm really reading here. I don't want you to disturb me. So he comes back in the middle of the night, and so Bashani, and he's like, what's up? What are you doing here? And he's like, well, I've come to tell you that American imperialism will no longer be, is not something to worry about. The American imperialism in Syria will end very soon.
Quite the prediction.
It's quite a prediction. And he goes on to say the next, modern weaponry, or modern technology, or nuclear weapons is no longer the issue. The next issue is on energy and electricity, and create a struggle, create a movement. Now this is a way, of accessing sort of the intellectual lives of working class, something that we've derided for far too long, and for something that we've tried to rationalize or seen as irrational. So, because
certainly a dream wouldn't be seen as a legitimate political text. If not for your work, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, these are ways of accessing ideas or sort of intelligence that has otherwise been derided as not being as such.
So going back to your personal relationship with Bashani,
Yes.
has he appeared to you in any dreams to give you political predictions?
I mean, he appears to me every day. And, like, you know, in some ways, my conversations never end around Bashani. There's always someone, wherever I go, someone has a story to tell me about Bashani. So my work continues, although it's a historical work, the memories of Bashani or the legacy of Bashani to this very day appears, and sort of the resonances of his work.
His network, in fact, stretches into the present.
Yes, his network stretched into very present. If you go to the US, you will find people there who are sort of, who've known Bashani for long or who've heard of Bashani. I mean, there is not...
So knowledge is still very much so circulating in
Yes.
these sort of non-standard, non-textual forms of
Yes.
politically predictive dreams.
Yes.
Yes. Would you consider yourself part of his network, his knowledge network?
Yes,
Yes.
I would. I mean, I think that's because in some ways this is a figure that hasn't been spoken about to this very day, or he continues to be ignored, and he doesn't continue because he's also someone who isn't producing text of his own. Now, the one thing about Bashani which is important is that he doesn't produce text. He's one of the, and so how do you talk about a leader that doesn't produce text?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in a way that Gandhi, produces text, Nehru produces text.
Right.
So, so yes,
You're
I'm
part of his
that.
network, but no dreams as of yet. That'll be next JLF.
No dreams. The only dreams that happened during the writing of the PhD, but I'm not sure if they qualify.
Great. So going, James, do you have any questions you want to ask, or shall I? Yeah?
Sure. Actually, I kind of wanted to pose a general question to the this side.
To the reactionary
To this
side,
Yes.
to the textual philologists.
Yeah, that's right.
Who are
Sort of with the goal of sticking these two halves together.
Sure.
So one thing that struck me while you're talking is, when you're asked, like, does he appear to you in dreams? I mean, maybe not. But, so he appears in conversation with you, like, every day, right? And it's sort of like... all of us, I mean, even when we're not working in modern knowledge networks, and I want to return to that later, are sort of part of the network that brings older networks into contemporary life. So a couple of us were at this film screening / lecture about sort of voodoo. Don't worry, we'll get back to the point. The other night, and like the guy was showing all of these clips about different voodoo films related to voodoo, like horror films and whatnot. And he's like, even though what we've been talking about is sort of racist tropes that show up about Haiti in all of these films, it actually strikes me that something else can happen. So the guy mentioned that he found this one symbol for one of these Afro-Caribbean deities. And he sort of started researching, looked it up, and made the point that actually these films also contain a kind of subterranean vector of this older network into our present that we can then, wittingly or not, I mean, shows up into the very space that we are now in, the Voodoo Cinema Hall, whatever. So I wanted to ask, I mean, all of you, as well as all of you, like, how do these sort of networks from the distant past sort of resonate in your contemporary experience? Like, do you ever find that you're a sort of vector for early modern knowledge in the contemporary world?
Are we channeling the past, basically?
Yeah, because this happens to me when, for example, I go to Sufi shrines and things like that, and then reproduce the things that they're saying to my students. Like, yeah, this guy was part of an interregional knowledge network, and his follower told me, well, you're from America, right? I was like, yes. So you're going to bring this back to America? I was like, maybe. He's like, yeah, you think that this is your action, but actually it's the saint. He's that powerful that in the contemporary world, he's still alive, and you're still talking to him. And moreover, all of the people who you talk to when you go back are also now going to know about him, and they didn't before. So do you ever find yourself feeling like a vector in
For the past?
Yeah.
A conduit, in a sense.
A conduit rather than a sort of,
I think Arthur does, definitely. as a conduit for Indo-Persian literature. And it's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you as well, is because it's this extinct tradition. I mean, you don't have anyone going to a market and buying vegetables in India using Persian. No one is sort of, mushairas don't happen in Persian anymore. So you and another sort of handful of Indo-Persian scholars, do you consider yourselves to be sort of keeping this alive?
Yeah, so I published a book about this 2 years ago, and the last chapter talks about the living tradition in India, and the two people that I featured in that have since died.
Oh my, okay.
So that's a very real indication of how fragile these connections with the past
can be.
are. I mean, after all, the thing that most people will recognize is that the tradition which is closest to this Indo-Persian tradition is present-day Urdu. We can talk about how well or poorly Urdu is faring on a sort of governmental level. It's quite brutally sidelined on a sort of more local level.
The script is as well. Not quite as
well, there's the question of how much the script is required for one to actually master the language. In fact, in the 50s, it was basically understood that if you were going to be an Urdu poet, you had to have a pretty good working knowledge of Persian because your Urdu wouldn't be wouldn't be proper if without it. So it's in my own scholarship, I find myself between two worlds, because I don't really, I have very little interest in present day or even historical Iran, but on the other hand, talking about Indo-Persian, it's difficult to make people understand just how there are echoes of Indo-Persian in so much of contemporary South Asian culture.
Absolutely, yeah. So it is a sort of project of reanimation and revivifying, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows the adage that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past.
I'm not sure I agree. I think they.
Well, I disagree.
And that's the problem.
Well, I disagree with that as well. And really, what the past offers us is a storehouse of, and this is a very old idea. It's a storehouse of cultural material and really of events that have been turned into literary moments. And so the value of Indo-Persian is really to sort of have this aspect of South Asian culture living that we can draw on, not because we want to live in the 18th century, but because it actually brings something to us. It brings meaning to us to be able to be able to engage with this. With this textualized past.
Absolutely. And so moving just briefly from the literary to the everyday, because I think James' question about voodoo, and I have to admit I was at the voodoo screening as well, so and it did bring up some interesting and surprisingly relevant questions. Just going from the literary sort of Sufi grand political leaders and how their traditions filter into the present and how we attempt to engage with them, moving to the everyday. The lives of people who maybe didn't leave a poem or a political movement. And that's the sort of material that you engage with, and I do as well, actually, sort of trade documents, letters, manumission documents, things that no one has read since they were made. Probably no one will read them again after we've read them. And so the question is, why? Why do this with your life?
It's a very pertinent question. The kind of individuals that I spend a lot of time on, like a Shrikaran Hirji, a Banya based in Porbandar in Gujarat, who was presiding over this growing, expanding merchant house, family merchant house in the middle of the 18th century, involved with, on one side, the Nawab of Arcot, on the other side, the Imam of Sana'a in western Yemen, or Serena, an Armenian wife, mother, and also responsible for being in charge of a workshop, a clearinghouse for her family firm of Armenians, who would send her material, goods, correspondence, which she would then send on. She was feeling very unhappy at the fact that her husband was refusing to return to where she was in southern Iraq because he wanted to remain in India and had been there for 10, 15, 20 years. And so these letters, these
17th century relationship problems.
17th, 18th, well, these are, in some senses, these are age-old, these are eternal. And clearly they were of deep, deep interest and concern to their authors and their readers. But why should we be interested in them? Why are they important for us? And the way I justify their broader interest and importance is because they were engaged in very significant activities that had an influence on populations more generally within their region in the 17th century, in the 18th century. So, in a sense, they are of importance like a state is of importance. If you're interested in state, you also need to know what enabled the state to persist. And these kind of activities vested in trade or intelligence or scholarship were intrinsic to that, even though we tend to know very little about them. But there's another way in which you can justify the significance of such individuals, these sub-elites, these ordinary folks. And that's sort of the bigger debates and questions, the larger stories that they help us to articulate, such as, what is the nature of the state, if so much that was of importance to it was going on outside, beyond the purview of the padshahs, the sultans, and their viziers and other high officials. So we need to know about these other things to understand what we traditionally spend much of our time looking at, or to move forward in time. Everyone, many of us, think about how did the Middle East, how did South Asia change as a result of the arrival of and the institutionalization of Europe's modern global empires, particularly the British Raj. But in order to know if things changed or not, you need to know what the situation was beforehand. And so spending time on the world in the 18th century or the 17th century, gaining a very, very palpable sense of it, establishes a baseline from which you can understand what occurs in the 19th and 20th century. And then just one final point, which plays off something which was being said just a moment ago. I challenge you to, my fellow panelists or anyone in the audience, I challenge you to find a South Asian or a Middle Easterner. I mean, go into any of these countries.
In the past or now?
No, today. And ask someone and he'll say, well, I'm a Hindustani, I'm a Punjabi, I'm a Mastri, I'm a Turk. You're not going to hear someone say, I'm a South Asian.
That's intellectuals in London who say that.
Right. But this is where the tyranny of these concepts block us from capturing some of the vernacular realities that persist down to today, as James was talking about in relation to his shrines. And then what we do, often unthinkingly, is project this back into the past. And this distorts in ways that we don't fully comprehend how we understand the past in relation to us in our here and now.
I would agree. Yes, James, do you?
Yeah, I want to build on that. And so, Panis, in your work, I mean, a lot of what you're doing is looking at exactly these kind of categories, but you're doing it in the contemporary world, where you can actually, I mean, a large part of your method is just spending time with people. In other words, ethnography. So how in your work do you see this kind of tension playing out? Like, what sorts of knowledge do you get from ethnographic fieldwork and from, so on one hand, ethnography, on the other hand, the art that people produce. How do these things sort of cut across, redefine, or in some cases reinforce geopolitical categories that we get from imperial category forming?
Yeah, I seriously begin to think about responsibility when producing knowledge. Because there is nothing, thinking of it going back to continental European philosophy, trying to grasp what even epistemology, meaning knowledge production, is. We have the classic Weberian approach saying that even research is a vocation. So the researcher can have an objective approach to his research subject, like me being segregated from this table and I can look at it and analyze it. But guess what? I'm not. Born in Tehran, raised in Germany, and now studying in the heart of the empire. I'm kind of in the middle of this table. And then I began my research in Tehran because of the ongoing insecurity. I couldn't be based in Kabul because family and mama and baba were worried, and university was also worried. So it becomes really, really, the personal is political, and where I think we have to also rethink, for instance, feminism. We're associating feminism, especially in the region, on the Asian continent. It is very much seen as a Western import, but I think in order to grasp the complexity of our times, we could see feminisms, and call it whatever you like, as a tool that enables me to think about my social positioning, an idea which came like in the past 20 years, particularly from Black feminist thought production. Patricia Hill Collins, for instance, talks about the social positioning of the knowledge-producing subject is important because it informs then the critical positioning. For instance, as a brown woman, brown Muslim woman, just an example, being constantly perceived as a brown person shapes then the way that I maybe politically identify, meaning my critical positioning, my access to knowledges, how I see the world is based on the way that people treat me and racialize me. In my own research, I mean, one of the greatest problems I have, and which doesn't allow me to sleep at night, is how to term the interviewees, of whom many have also become friends, the artists and art students. Because in Tehran, I learned that those with an Afghanistani passport didn't want to be called Afghan because they're dominantly Hazara Shias who identify as Afghanistani, which is a term that hasn't been used that much in English literature at all. And even in Iran, there is a limited amount of publications you find where Afghanistani is being discussed. Using this term in Kabul creates reactions like, who do you think you are? Like, we're Afghans, all of us. Didn't you read the constitution? Like, since 2004, Hazara, Uzbek, Tajik, there's no difference. But when you talk to a Hazara in Kabul, we'll be like, no, I'm just Hazara. You know? So we have this complexity of how the research subjects with a capital letter, not lowercase, very important, identify themselves. And then there's the problem of the nation state, which makes me become more and more anarchistic. And this is why I'm feeling really happy on this side. Because when you're born and raised, I mean, many of you who are born and raised in England, but have maybe origins somewhere in South Asia, but just go maybe once a year for holiday, can relate to that, like myself in my relation with Iran. Afghans who were born and raised in Iran have often never seen Afghanistan. But because of the impossibility and the same problem we have in Pakistan to receive the citizenship of Pakistan or Iran, being naturalized, they're constantly being what I call Afghanized. So in order to kind of find a way in between, an alternative, I start calling my research subjects not Afghan, but Afghanized bodies, because they're literally just being reduced to their passport. And the politics of the passport shape then their access to national exhibitions, to universities. I've talked to people who weren't allowed to study at the University of Tehran because they have almond-shaped eyes. You know, and how does this then? I mean, they're the black people. Literally, Hazaras are the blacks of Iran, and similarly to Pashtus at the Afghan-Pakistani border in the borderlands. So this question of I would like to bring up is, can we recover at all? I became very skeptical about that because I think, and I've been talking to white students in Germany about that, who are like white Germans who are struggling with how to approach issues of racism in today's imperialized world. And I think there's always in post-colonial feminisms this approach of rendering people visible, giving voice to people. They are visible. You didn't discover them. It's us. We need a new hearing aid. And I think thinking about it instead of like putting on the right glasses, but rather as a hearing aid. And you never know like whether this hearing aid is actually working. You can try to use through, for instance, ethnographic tools, the right methods. But still, there's always this critical potential that because of your social positioning, you can't see what another person might see.
Absolutely. So that has brought us right up to the contemporary.
Well, no, but it's actually a good question.
It's a brilliant question,
for
both for the contemporary and for the past as well.
That's what I was going.
Because what we've been talking about is this idea of recovering, but it's different because the people aren't there, right? So we are dealing with their traces that they've left somehow. And this is an epistemic crisis that I know you've certainly suffered from, I've certainly suffered from, as a historian, is actually, what are we doing? Are we recovering anything? What are the histories that we're writing? What are the narratives that we're writing? And, you know, by reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of archival documents, or, you know, what are we actually doing? What is the narrative that we're writing? So that being said, that was thank you very much for that, bringing it straight to the present. We actually have about 15 minutes left for questions, so we can open the discussion to the audience. And I liked your question about spatiality, because let's not forget where we are as well, right? And the repository that we're sitting on, and what that means, and how that was put together, and that we're in a building called the Knowledge Center, talking about knowledge networks, and what the implications of that might be, and questions of access as well, and access to knowledge. So please, we welcome your questions, comments. We've got 2 microphones there, so if you could just put your hands up if you have any questions. I know a lot has been said over the course of this panel, many different themes.
So hi everyone, thanks very much for your insight. I have a question regarding languages and how it's been communicated from the past to today, really. Well, actually, I'm Mauritian, so I speak 4 languages. I study quite a lot of etymology, and I think, well, in my personal opinion, I see a lot of similarities along the 4 languages I speak. And I think it's quite unnerving to see the emerging rise of nationalism in today's world. Well, I'm personally against it. And I think that going back to etymology and really the roots of languages would eliminate quite a lot of racism in today's world, in our doubts regarding each other. So what would be your views on etymology, on how language shapes our world?
That's a very good question. I think what you're proposing is a kind of revolutionary philology, actually. So, any comments on language, how language shapes our world, and etymologies?
I'll give you an anecdote which captures perfectly what you say about the insidious role of nationalism. My mother, born and brought up in India, in northern India, a few years ago, I told her that, you know Urdu. And she said, never. Then I said, don't you watch Davar, Humsafar, no. All these wonderful Bollywood films? And she would say, well, of course I do, and it's in Hindi. Posed that same question. I posed that same question to somebody from Lahore. Yeah. And I said, well, you know Hindi? And she said, absolutely not. But don't you understand the Sholay and the Davar? And it's exactly what you say. Categories emerge, and they create difference, even though on a day-to-day level, people can, down to today, interact with one another. And the language which I hold as the exemplar for how people could meet and engage and tolerate and even coexist with one another is Ottoman, the language that precedes Turkish. I mean, the maddest of maddest languages out there.
Everything.
You can't, you can't, even though it's an archaic language which has some relationship to, so some say, Japanese, it's a language which you can't learn and understand properly if you don't know Persian and Arabic and probably other languages too, as well as Turkish.
Kurdish,
and yet,
Greek,
Kurdish,
Armenian.
And yet it worked. Somehow this hodgepodge language worked. And you see this in the form of, well, if nothing else, there was an empire. that persisted for something like 4, 5, 6 centuries. Why can't we have something like that today?
Any answers to that? Would anyone like to? Do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi. I've got a question which is sort of connected to the languages question. So whether you look at any of the languages, Sanskrit or Hindi or anything, aside from being some sort of knowledge of learning to speak in your own culture or own language, a lot of these languages actually contained a lot of scribes of knowledge of indigenous knowledge as well. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the scriptures of Ayurvedic medicine, which is a lot of it is in Sanskrit, then it's containing knowledge or recipes that were used across the whole of the Asian subcontinent, maybe other areas as well, which was connected to Mother Nature, connected to natural holistic medicines, and also how we sort of connect to each other in the world as well. So my question is, just like the languages question, how indigenous knowledge used to shape our world hundreds of years ago, and now you've got this space where anything which is regards to indigenous knowledge, especially medicine, is, especially if it's coming from Asia, is regarded as something alternative. It's not regarded as something which, even though it made up most of world history because it was so much was populated in Asia, is still regarded as something which is other over there stuff. And when I'm talking about medicine, Western medicine considers just within their scope how they calculate things. But there's no space or there's no recognition of these indigenous knowledge. And just to ask again, do you think or that indigenous knowledge can reshape our world again, and actually how it can actually maybe reconnect each other as well, because it's something which is so different from Persian language to Sanskrit, I'm sure. How can it actually reconnect us?
Your question very much relates to some of the key themes in the panel about the marginalization of certain types, certain thought worlds and embodied knowledge. So I don't know, maybe who would be the best person to answer this one? James?
Sure. No, one of the things that strikes me, even apart from the sort of power differential that you're talking about in knowledge networks, is the fact that even amidst this power differential, you get these sort of eruptions into, like, leaving aside contemporary medical knowledge networks in the contemporary world, let's think about the Ayurvedic and other medical texts that you're talking about. I mean, a lot of this, it sort of exists on a subcontinental level, but you also get sort of regional knowledge that comes in and sort of cross-fertilizes across distances, like local everyday people figuring it out over centuries or millennia. These people are anonymous. We don't know who they are. We don't know what processes they used to come up with this knowledge. In a lot of cases, I mean, we have to imagine that like this comes out of just the interaction of humans with the natural world in a way that is not like what we do now. I mean, that people sort of read nature itself as a sort of semiotic system, as certain anthropologists would argue. And so that opens up for me, and I can see why you, because we've had this discussion quite a bit. Yeah. I mean, for me, it opens up like a lot of questions about how sort of these are not like the networks that we've been talking about, where we have nameable, placeable individuals who have like their own contribution to the network. Even in the case of like sub-elite or working class. Here, what we've got is a gigantic pool of just knowledge that sort of makes its presence felt in...
And it's quite diffuse, actually. I mean, it would exist amongst sort of everyone at the time. I mean, we've talked about medicine, but things like cooking, for instance.
Right.
I mean, that's like thousands and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and practice that isn't seen as a as an epistemology.
Exactly. Like if you it's even a sort of pre-rational one too. I mean, like think about cooking, for example. Like if you ask me how to make like the particular type of plow that I make, I would not be able to describe you the steps. I mean, I could show you. You'd have to stand next to me and we do all the steps. But like if I were to describe this, I mean, it would not come out right. You know, you have to actually be in the context and watch it and smell it, and like your whole sensory experience has to be part of it too. This kind of body knowledge and the situatedness and contextuality is something that I think is really important for a lot of the things that we're talking about, even if we don't find that in the research that we produce. So that for me was one of the biggest questions about the whole thing. It's like, is the way that we look at networks in the past conditioned by the fact that we're intellectuals or academics or whatever we are with names and like we exist in this network of people who know each other.
We've gone through particular systems, which goes back to this question of access to knowledge.
So does our own sort of network place,
of course,
I mean,
completely conditioned,
prejudice the way that we look at these past networks, which might be more anonymous and necessarily embodied?
May I add something?
Yeah, sure. There's one question there, but please go ahead. Yeah, add your.
I think it's a very important point that the young gentleman highlighted, because, and it makes us question, how can we change that? Are we just waiting for systems to change? Systems will not change. Neoliberalism is going on to increase growth and production, the pharma industry. There's a particular material reality why Western medicine is dominant, but where is it dominant? You know, it's also important, like, I think, to bring here the status of knowledge production by people who are migrants, like myself, for instance, and came at some point to Europe. But if I go back to Iran and talk to my grandmother, her, exactly like James described, the context of...
Sorry to interrupt that very brilliant point.
Speaking of health,
no, the access to knowledges is then really different. So I think the audience really matters also. Like,
and the place.
The place and the audience. Like, do we want... If you don't want to take it serious, then we have to also be the actors to show why there is a reason then that Ayurvedic medicine is not an alternative form, but a 1,000-year-old practice that has worked to a certain extent. And how can actually these complement each other? You know, I don't think it's about like erasing the one and making the other dominant, but how can we create amalgams that actually represent also our own knowledges, that are hybrids of like European culture meets like me going to Bangladesh and traveling to Afghanistan. What kind of knowledges do shape then how I see the world?
Thank you. We have one more question, and then I think we probably have to draw to a close, but please.
I was actually quite interested in this altogether because I'm actually from Goa, and in our family we've always used as many natural products, Ayurvedic products, as possible. But I'm also a scientist, so I'm a chemist from Oxford. And I was approached about 6 months ago to become the chair of a company called Sibelius. And what we have is we have an epigenetic platform for actually validating natural products. So one of our clients is a big French cosmetic company. They have a product, an Ayurvedic product, and they came to us and said, can you validate that it is going to be good? And we've put it through our system, and we've been able to show that cell regeneration increases 30%, and therefore, you know, in their next product, they're going to be able to scientifically say, this is correct. So, you know, we're actually able to say, you know, some of the old remedies, you know, there is some validity to it. It's not, you know, old wives' tales. It is actually doing something.
Yes. Is there a question, or you're just
agreeing? No, I was just making that comment in relation to you can have...
Okay. You can have both, basically.
You can have both.
You can have this amalgam. It does exist. You have a question.
I mean, no, not necessarily a question. I do think there is a danger in trying to recover this sort of authentic indigenous knowledge and trying to sort of put it within our present day realities. I think it obscures some of when we're thinking about sort of
But obscures inequalities, for sure.
It obscures inequalities, access to equal access to healthcare, equal access to public sector provision. So I think there's a danger in sort of using or trying to recover the ancient knowledge. And I think we have to be careful. And we see this in our sort of present day politics and how we try to recover the good Muslim through Dar Shikoh, or how we try to rehabilitate Aurangzeb in order to, and which in itself obscures sort of present day realities for Muslims in India, Muslims elsewhere. And I think that's, I just want to put a caveat there as to how there is a danger.
We want to complicate the networks a bit.
We want to complicate the networks, but not obscure present-day realities.
So on that cautionary note, I think we have to draw to a close. So thank you very much for having this discussion with us, for contributing your questions. Let's give our speakers a round of applause. And thank you very much.
Yes, please join me in thanking again all of our speakers for coming. For the most interesting and insightful tweets that we've received at our hashtag, there are 3 winners. So if any of you are in here, I'm just going to read out their Twitter handles. Life is a Festival, Vic Ecstatic, and Naomi Canton. So if any 3 of you are in here, you're welcome to go and collect your gift bags at the festival office. Thanks very much.